little sense to us. But as paleontologists excavate those bones and interpret the data, a picture begins to emerge. So the unfolding story of the dinosaur does not end with the excavation of fossils in the field.
It continues on here in the lab, where the fossils must now be restored. It can take anywhere from several hours to several days to prepare a single bone. And it may be months before an entire animal has been completed. When the fossils arrive at the lab, they're usually in pieces. The first step is to reassemble and glue each bone. Although most of the rock matrix covering the fossil is removed in the field, the final cleaning is done here in the lab. Hand tools may be used if the matrix is soft. Air tools, similar to dental drills, are used when the matrix is harder and more difficult to remove. Once the fossil has been completely freed of rock and dirt, the gaps left between the fossil pieces are filled in with plaster. Technicians must be very careful not to obscure the natural contours of the bone. After the plaster patches have dried, they are buffed and polished. A large vacuum hood is used to eliminate the fine dust and debris. A thin, airtight sealant is then applied over the entire bone to protect the fossil from everyday handling during research. Now that the bone has been restored and protected, it can be studied more thoroughly, and some deductions made about its function and position on the dinosaur. This particular fossil, which we have now seen excavated and restored, is part of what paleontologists call the frill. This computer graphic shows us where this bone was located on the Pachyrhinosaurus. Paleontologist Bob Backer explains the function of the frill.
One wonderful thing you notice about dinosaurs, horned dinosaurs, is they have things growing out of their faces. Prongs and squiggles and tchotchkes and horns and hornlets and frills. Why? Well, some of them are clearly defense. Usually there's a big horn on the nose, maybe over the eyes. Dangerous weapon, anti-predator. What about all the other tchotchkes? To understand those, you need to go to a zoo that has a lot of tropical birds and look at, say, a lot of parrots or a lot of toucans, and you'll see the individual species tell each other apart by cranial clues, identification badges, because it's extremely important in the mating season to court a mate of your own species. These wonderful bumps and prongs in horned dinosaurs were almost certainly color-coded. These animals had eyes like birds, they could see color. So that a male Pachyrhinosaur, a bull, looking across the landscape in early spring could immediately pick out members of his own species that were adult females. And that ID badge then could serve as a come-hither lure so that courtship and mating and successful breeding, the Darwinian game, could be played effectively.
This is a reconstruction of a fossilized dinosaur egg. Paleontologists can learn a great deal from these. Now, nobody knows more about dinosaur eggs than paleontologist Jack Horner of the Montana State University.
We have evidence from duckbill dinosaurs that these kinds of dinosaurs, and possibly ceratopsians as well, nested in gigantic colonies, possibly 500 to 800 nests in one area, that the dinosaurs laid their eggs in bowl-shaped depressions, probably covered them with vegetation. We don't know what the incubation period was, but it was probably relatively short based on the size of the eggs. When the babies would have hatched out of the eggs, they apparently did not leave the nest, at least with duckbills and possibly ceratopsians, but rather stayed in the nest and were brought food by the adults. Babies stayed in the nest from the time they hatched until they reached, at least with duckbill dinosaurs, about 3.5 to 4 feet in length. And at that point, they apparently left the nest. They were able to walk, get around with the adults, left the nest, and evidence that we have beyond that comes both from duckbill bone beds and from ceratopsian bone beds.
Dinosaurs' lifespans are really neat. We know that lifespan can be related to body weight. You can make a mathematical thing we call a regression on it. And using regressions like that based on living animals, you can estimate a brontosaur. A big one would have lived somewhere in excess of 100 years. And you can actually count the growth rings in brontosaur bone and see that the animals were indeed long-lived. On the contrary, duck-billed dinosaurs here were reptilian beef cattle that matured within 4 years, and probably most of them were dead after 8.
Dinosaurs hatched from amazingly small eggs, considering that they often grew up to be very large. Now, the egg couldn't be too large, simply because the larger the egg, the thicker its shell. And a thick shell would mean no escape for the hatchling. But hatching was the least of the baby Pachyrhinosaurus's problems.
Struthiomimus was a constant threat, a keen opportunist who would steal a meal wherever possible. He was equipped with a hard, sharp beak, perfect for cracking shells. And the tender insides of dinosaur eggs were a favorite food.
I'm tremendously impressed, working in Wyoming as I do, at the cascade of data coming from Montana and Alberta, and Mongolia too, about horned dinosaur nesting behavior, how they raise their young. A few years ago, we didn't know much. We knew that in Mongolia, little horned dinosaurs, Protoceratops, laid nests. But now we know from the new evidence, the spectacular herds and nesting grounds in Alberta and Montana, that the big ones too laid nests. They constructed complicated nests. They guarded the eggs as they incubated in the sand. And when the young hatched out, unlike a turtle, unlike a lizard or a snake, those young would immediately be protected by and fed by the parents. We're getting a picture then of Pachyrhinosaurus as an incredibly socially integrated animal, as a good mother, as a good father, as a social context in which the young hatches, is fed, is protected from predators, grows up in the herd to become an adult female, an adult male, engage in courtship, and continue the generation. And here, all this wonderful data is a clue to why ceratopsians and other dinosaurs were such outstanding successes. They were social sophisticates.
When dinosaurs were first mounted for display, the original fossils were used. This meant that a heavy metal framework was necessary to support the weight of the skeleton. Unfortunately, this produced a cumbersome specimen that often sacrificed authenticity in the poses for balance and stability. Even worse, in order to fit the bones onto the armatures, holes were drilled into the fossils, forever damaging them, lessening their value to future.
Rather than mounting or reconstructing the original specimen, what we do oftentimes is cast the bones. In other words, make a plaster or plastic reproduction.
In order to make a cast of the fossil, a mold is produced. First, the fossil is set into a base and a plasticine wall is built around the perimeter of the bone to act as a divider between the two halves of the mold, allowing it to be separated later. Guides for pouring spots are then placed, which will leave tunnels through which the cast can be poured later. In order to prevent any distortion caused by the two halves of the mold shifting, registration holes or keys are punched to lock the mold together, ensuring a perfect reproduction of the original fossil. Now that the framework of the mold is complete, a layer of liquid rubber is applied which flows into the cracks and crevices of the fossil and hardens, preserving an exact negative of the original. Rubber is perfect for preserving detail, but because it's too flexible to hold its shape during the pouring of the mold, a rigid fiberglass backing must be applied. Cellophane acts as a separator between the rubber and the fiberglass backing. Fiberglass squares are soaked with resin and laid, one over another, until a layer is created half a centimeter thick. "24 hours later, when the fiberglass is dried, the mold is opened and the original fossil removed. Then, into this completed mold, the cast is poured. Finally, a perfect cast. The cast is roughly attached in its proper place on the head of the Pachyrhinosaurus. Each prepared bone is added to the specimen, one after another, until the skeleton is complete. The technicians and the paleontologists need to be skilled anatomists to determine exactly where every bone belongs. The scientists at the Royal Tyrrell Museum have had plenty of experience. Over 30 different species of dinosaur have been constructed here. The Albertosaurus, Centrosaurus, Troodon, Stegosaurus, Euplocephalus, Struthiomimus, Parasaurolophus, and some other creatures we often mistake for dinosaurs.
Other animals that we often, or at least children often think of as being dinosaur-like creatures are the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs and even the big fin-backed Dimetrodon, things like that. Dimetrodon is an animal that's splayed, has its legs out to the side, so we know that isn't a dinosaur. Technically, a dinosaur is a diapsid reptile that walks with its legs directly underneath it. Now, there are other animals like the pterosaurs that people generally think of as dinosaurs, the big flying reptiles, but until we understand how their legs work, we're not sure that they are a dinosaur. So right now, they're kind of left out of it.
The Quetzalcoatlus, with its 16-meter wingspan, was the largest of the pterosaurs. Although this carnivore survived mainly on a diet of fish, vulnerable dinosaur young were easy prey.
In Alberta, we have a number of sites which clearly show certain species of dinosaurs, at least, would congregate into large herds. And one of the questions we started asking ourselves is, why were these dinosaurs congregating into herds? It's good for protection, particularly if you're at a stage where you're laying eggs and you want to protect your young and so on. But it's very hard on the environment. If you can imagine herds of anywhere from 400 or 500 4-ton animals to maybe as many as 10,000 animals of the same size moving through a forest, you get the idea that they would be incredibly destructive on that ecosystem. They couldn't stay there for very long. So it seems clear to me that these dinosaurs had to be animals that were moving. We've been studying the remains of dinosaurs in the Arctic Circle recently, and not too surprisingly, they're turning out to be the same animals that we're finding in Alberta. And we're starting to develop this picture now where maybe once a year these dinosaurs would collect into huge herds, move north into the Arctic to take advantage of that high plant productivity. Once they're in the Arctic, they probably dispersed so that they weren't causing a lot of damage in any one region. But as the fall came on, they would collect into herds again, move south to an area where there was enough sunlight to sustain plant growth all year round.
Now, there are 3 ages of dinosaurs. The very first one, most people don't know about because the dinosaurs were mostly small and they were second bananas to other critters. The early dinosaurs were some meat eaters, like Coelophysis, no bigger than a wolf. Some plant eaters pushing the size of a pony, like prosauropods. But they weren't famous. They didn't dominate the world. The next period, the Jurassic, then they took over. The Jurassic is the golden age of giants when you have Brontosaurus and Supersaurus and Barosaurus and Etceterasaurus, 10, 20, 30, 40 tons, long-necked monsters, huge tails. And with those guys, they were plant eaters, were plant-eating stegosaurs with armor plate, and a few smaller plant eaters and big meat eaters like allosaurs. Third period, the Cretaceous. The greatest diversity of plant eaters. The great horned dinosaurs, many kinds. Armor-plated tanks, the ankylosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs in bewildering variety, wonderful critters. And preying on them, Tyrannosaurus rex and its kin.
The Albertosaurus, one of the most highly evolved of the carnivorous dinosaurs, often preyed upon the Pachyrhinosaurus. Even with the advantages of its heightened senses, powerful thighs, and razor-sharp teeth, the Albertosaurus was not always the victor.
One of the great things about working on dinosaurs is, first of all, they're interesting to me personally, but we also get the positive reinforcement of other people being interested in the subject that I work on. And this leads to some very fascinating collaborations. For example, there are people who do films on dinosaurs, science fiction books, comic books. Children are, of course, fascinated with dinosaurs, and artists are fascinated with dinosaurs. And I really enjoy working with artists because they help bring some of the things or some of the images that are in my mind on how these animals lived and acted and what their world was like, and bring them to life.
The excitement of interpreting the life and anatomy of the Pachyrhinosaurus continues. Using information compiled by the paleontologist from the completed skeleton, the artist is able to draw a scale diagram. The complex musculature is then reconstructed over the skeletal drawing, using evidence from tendon scars on the bone surfaces and comparisons with the dinosaur's closest living relatives, crocodiles and birds. With this two-dimensional drawing as a guide, in conjunction with other evidence, skin texture, the shapes and sizes of teeth and horns, and some educated guesswork, the artist renders a three-dimensional scale model of the dinosaur as it looked in life.
Saurornitholestes was one of the small carnivorous dinosaurs, and it has two very close relatives that are probably a bit better known. That's Deinonychus from Montana and Velociraptor from Central Asia. This is an interesting little animal because in many characteristics it's a very primitive dinosaur, and yet in the late Cretaceous it's still very successful. Certainly one of the most successful of the carnivorous dinosaurs of that time. It has a large claw that's been adapted to probably disemboweling prey. It's raised above the ground. It looks like a giant can opener. Recently, there's been some research going on in Mongolia to suggest that these dinosaurs may have survived because they moved in a different manner than most other dinosaurs. If you look at the limbs, the tail, and the hips of this animal, they suggest that this dinosaur may have been a hopping animal. And because it was moving in a different way, it may have exploited different types of prey than other carnivorous dinosaurs like Troodon.
We have a hard time sometimes with carnivorous dinosaurs trying to figure out how they acquired their meat. For example, people have thought for years that Tyrannosaurus rex was a big predatory dinosaur. But as we begin to study the bones and understand the mechanics of living animals, we find that it's very difficult to imagine how a Tyrannosaurus rex could actually catch something. And so we begin thinking maybe there's another option. Maybe a Tyrannosaurus rex was a scavenger. But we don't know. Now, when it comes to other kinds of dinosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, horned dinosaurs, we're pretty sure they were plant eaters because they have what appear to be flat grinding teeth. Looks like they could chew their food. We have a lot of animals, ankylosaurs, nodosaurs, things like that, that have very peculiar teeth.
Edmontonia was one of the armored dinosaurs found in Alberta from about 65 to 80 million years ago. And this particular animal didn't have a bony tail club. It did have armor over most of its back and some very large spikes over the shoulder region. We know that Edmontonia was an animal that was probably capable of digging with its front limbs. Why it would do that, we're not quite sure, although the majority of specimens tend to be found not in the coastal lowland regions, but in drier upland regions. The teeth on Edmontonia, and in fact all ankylosaurs, are a bit of an anomaly because they don't have the sophisticated chewing mechanisms that you find in, say, the horned dinosaurs or the duck-billed dinosaurs. And they're actually quite weak as a type of dentition. So we're trying to figure out exactly what an animal like Edmontonia would have eaten.
Dinosaur. It comes from the Greek word saurus, meaning lizard, and dinos, meaning terrible. Terrible lizard. Edmontonia, Saurornitholestes, Albertosaurus, Daspletosaurus. Where do dinosaur names originate?
Dinosaurs are given names just like any other living organism. You have really a two-part name, a generic name and a specific name. The generic name is kind of, well, it's kind of like our last name. And the specific name is kind of like our first name. And the names are in Latin or Greek, and usually have some meaning that describe the animal. Tyrannosaurus rex is a good example. Tyrant, lizard, king.
I can see where the name says something specific about this animal. Tyrannosaurus rex, king of all the dinosaurs. This great tyrant was the last carnivore of the late Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago. Now, he wasn't around at the time of the Pachyrhinosaurus, some 5 million years earlier, but his predecessor, his Pletosaurus, he was.
And like Tyrannosaurus rex, Daspletosaurus ruled his world and laid claim to everything in it. The digested remains of a dinosaur meal can tell us a lot. Analysis of the contents of coprolites, or fossilized dinosaur dung, gives insight into how dinosaurs lived by revealing what they ate. And a clear picture of how dinosaurs looked is provided by fossilized skin imprints. Certainly these hardened remains contain valuable evidence. But aside from fossil bones, nothing provides more information than dinosaur footprints.
One of the really neat things you can do with fossil dinosaur footprints, and we have thousands of them, you can use them to calculate the day-to-day pace of dinosaur life. If dinosaurs were cold-blooded critters like giant lizards, their average rate of walking would be real slow, mile per hour or so. Because cold-blooded animals just don't have to move because they don't need much food or water, and they grow slow. When you actually measure dinosaur footprints, you can calculate the speed at which they were walking. Simple formula will do. You find out that Brontosaurus cruised around as fast as an elephant, duck-billed dinosaurs were cruising around as fast as ostriches, and Tyrannosaurus rex footprints indicate that packs of rex were cruising around looking for food as fast as wolf packs do today, up in 3 or 4 miles an hour. So we get an intimate look, a peek at how vigorous dinosaur life was, second to second, pace by pace.
And so too, through their fossilized remains, the Pachyrhinosaurs have provided a peek into their lives. Through the reconstruction of their skeletons, we've learned how they looked. From the number of fossil remains, that they lived in herds. From the shape of their jaws and teeth, that they were plant eaters. That they laid eggs and cared for their young. That they migrated in search of food. And the Pachyrhinosaur's bone bed still has one more story to tell. How this herd died.
Herds are always susceptible to mass death. And first of all, if they perhaps pick up a disease can spread through a herd much faster than it can spread through a population that's spread over a very wide area. So it's conceivable that disease was a cause of a mass death that would form one of these bone beds. However, we have a site in Dinosaur Park where we think a more likely explanation is that they were killed trying to cross a river in flood. And it's the kind of thing that still happens today. Back in about 1985, there was a herd of caribou in northern Quebec that tried to cross the river in flood. Now, a caribou can swim a river without any trouble as long as it's by itself. But as soon as these animals start jumping into the water as groups, they start pushing each other underwater, and you start developing a mass panic. In the case of the bone bed in Dinosaur Park, the same thing seems to have happened because all the animals are distributed along a stream channel, and all of the bones, they're all current aligned. So there's no question that water was involved, at least in part of the ultimate burial and orientation of the bones in the Pachyrhinosaurus bone bed. So it is conceivable that the explanation of mass drowning would be a good one for Pachyrhinosaurus too.
Many hundreds of hours have gone into the task of bringing the Pachyrhinosaurus to life. From the first discovery and excavation of the fossils in the ground, to the restoration of the bones, through their casting, onto the mounting of the skeleton, to the final fleshing. This process obviously takes great patience and skill. But why bother? What is to be gained by studying dinosaurs?
It's hard to justify why a person works on dinosaurs, because obviously it doesn't put food on the table or gasoline in your car, but more important, I guess, it helps satisfy some of the curiosity that we have.
Fossil history is a beautiful thing to think about, and people like to think about it. And that's why tens of millions of people go to natural history museums. It doesn't help us find oil, it doesn't help us cure diseases, but it sure does wonderful things for our brains, thinking about dinosaurs.
We wonder about our own chance of success when an animal that was as successful as a dinosaur eventually did become extinct. And they dominated the world for 140 million years. We've been around for maybe 4 million years, depends on how you interpret human evolution, but no more than that. And already we're starting to worry about our own future after such a short...
Thanks to the paleontology, the great dinosaurs rule once again in our imaginations. But perhaps the greatest puzzle of the dinosaur was not that they lived, but why they died. Something happened 65 million years ago to cause the extinction of all the dinosaurs. Their long dynasty was ended forever.
By far the best hypothesis now is that a comet was a protocometary body about a half a light year away from the sun, was somehow nudged out of its orbit and fell into the inner solar system. And it fell for 400,000 years. And when it reached the orbit of the Earth happened to occupy its orbit. And it came, by that time it was traveling at a velocity of about 60 to 70 kilometers per second. And it would have developed a tail by the time it crossed the orbit of Mars. And it came in and released a tremendous amount of energy, so much so that not only did the rocks turn to gas, they turned to plasma. They were stripped of their electrons, and from the moment of impact, then it behaved like a titanic nuclear explosion. And there are a whole series of consequences of that, environmental consequences. We talk about, for example, Chernobyl and things like that, and this is just a nuclear power plant, which is peanuts, compared to this thing, which was had the energy content of hundreds of thousands of times the current nuclear stockpile. And this caused a tremendous environmental degradation in which the dinosaurs and 75% of living things on Earth disappeared.
Now, there's a myth that dinosaurs went extinct in some terrible catastrophe. It didn't happen. At the very end of the Cretaceous period, there was not a catastrophe on land. 99% of the animals around, species, genera, families of species, survived. If you were a frog, you survived. Toads survived, lizards, salamanders, snakes, turtles, crocodiles, small mammals, little furry things, they all survived. 99% of the land animals survived. It wasn't a disaster. 1% went extinct. An important percent, all the dinosaurs went extinct. That's a key clue. Think about what survived, not what died. How can we keep most animals alive on land? Just kill the big ones. One way to do that is travel. Big animals, if you give them a land bridge, travel. And when big animals travel, they can get into big trouble because they meet new diseases. Every large species of animal has 10 or 20 diseases it carries with it, its own diseases. It can survive those. But when those diseases are transported to a new continent across a land bridge, those transported diseases cause disaster.
We can see that dinosaurs were very successful 10 million years before they went extinct. We can see that 5 million years before they went extinct, they may not have been as successful anymore, that their numbers may have been dropping off. The diversity was decreasing. Particularly in Alberta, this is carried through to an extreme at the end of the Cretaceous here, because once you move north of Drumheller and you look at the rocks that are at the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, you've only got about a half a dozen species of dinosaurs left. Now, if dinosaur diversity is dropping off in a course of 10 million years from 35 species down to 6 species, what that's suggesting is that in this part of the world at least, we may have had gradual extinction of dinosaurs. Maybe the asteroid finished them off, but it wasn't the cause of all dinosaurs dying.
I don't care what killed the dinosaurs. It doesn't make any difference to me, I don't think. I think the most important thing is that we understand why dinosaurs were successful. And I don't think we're ever going to be able to figure out why dinosaurs went extinct until we understand their success.
Well, it's plain to see that the experts don't all agree on what caused the extinction of the dinosaur. And perhaps we will never understand what really ended their reign 65 million years ago. But although the paleontologists don't agree on what killed the dinosaurs, there is one thing they do agree on. That is that their fascination for dinosaurs will never die. And so thanks to the science of paleontology, we will continue to look back in awe and wonder at these mystifying creatures from a prehistoric time.
Make a date with us tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. for the last part of this 3-part documentary in Hunting the Dragon, Secrets of the Dinosaur. Meanwhile, stay tuned for NBA Jam in Mandarin.